Thanks for inviting me. This has been a hard time for all of us, I think, in so many ways. And I confess that until you invited me to give this talk, I'd sort of crawled into my own little hole, and I hadn't thought about all the different ramifications of what we're working on right now for the current situation. So thanks for getting me to think about that. And that got me to start here, perhaps, which is an uncommon ground. This is the Lake of the Ozarks, Missouri. You may have, if you've been watching the news the last couple of days, you may have seen some of these pictures. It's about 2 hours outside of St. Louis, and a lot of people from St. Louis go there for vacations and trips and for Memorial Day weekend, actually. And what you may have seen on the news would be this that happened here a couple of days ago. Not exactly social distancing. And it got me really thinking, how in the world can this happen? Who are these people, and how does that connect to to our issues? And that got me thinking back to something that I've brought up when I've given this conversation in the past, which is this woman, Arlie Russell Hochschild. Her book is something I really recommend to you, Strangers in Their Own Land. And she actually has commented on this. She said the theme that I'll talk about from her is that liberals and conservatives think differently in terms of the narratives that are in our heads. And on this issue, she commented, I think this was yesterday, well, I gotta get this, there we go. She said there's an underlying, how do I make that go away? There we go. She said there's an underlying stoicism amongst these folks that was there predating the pandemic. Oh, no, it's not.
Ed, is everybody able to see Ed's slides? Just raise your hand. Thank you.
All right, was that a yes? I couldn't tell.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I can't, but everybody else can.
Okay. I don't know why you can't. But. So what Professor Hochschild said was that these folks that went to do this sort of insane violation of health recommendations think about it this way. They think about it as these liberals, snowflake liberals who can't take it, who are just too dainty and fragile and are not hardy like us, they said. And this gets to what she talks about as these two deep narratives that people have, liberals and conservatives. And I should back up and say that's sort of what I'm going to talk about tonight in the next bit of time, is run through a handful of different models of how liberals and conservatives think. And I'll try to make it relevant to how we can communicate about Medicare for all, and specifically in the post-COVID or the COVID era. So the first model we'll talk about is this one, about how liberals and conservatives have different deep narratives. Liberals often think we're proud of the public space. We built this public space. It's ours as a nation, and marauders are invading the public space and dismantling it and building their McMansions with our public bricks. So liberals often feel offended to see our common good being torn apart. Conservatives often have a different deep narrative, and theirs is more that they've been waiting in line for the American dream. They're proud of the fact that they've been waiting in line, they've been waiting there patiently, but they see the line for the American dream not moving. And then when they see the line not moving, they look and see that the government is escorting people from the back of the line to the front of the line, and they feel offended by that. And that's what she says is the deeper narrative that describes how they're thinking. So she developed this model after embedding herself in oil country in Louisiana for, I think, 5 years. And she was trying to reconcile why those sorts of areas would vote against their economic self-interest. And that this was her basic conclusion, that economic self-interest is never entirely absent, but she discovered the profound importance of emotional self-interest, which is not a, well, what the heck just happened? I just lost my, now I lost one of my things. Oh God, I don't know how to get back. Something
So
just,
is your share screen gone, Ed?
my screen, there we go. Can you see it again?
Everybody said yes.
Okay, so so the question is, why is it that people vote against their economic self-interest? And she said that it's for this reason, because they vote for their emotional self-interest. And these are narratives that we don't hit as reliably. We tend to talk about Medicare for all from a very factual point of view, and we don't do as well on these other issues: emotions, moral values, tribalism, personal liberty. And personal liberty is the thing that got everybody to go to Lake of the Ozarks this weekend. you know, that you can't, and we just, this last week, we repealed our motorcycle helmet law in Missouri. Personal liberty is the theme, I think, that drives people to violate this. And we need to speak in terms of these narratives more than in anything else. So that takes me to George Lakoff, and I know many of you probably know of him. Some of you may know him personally. He was instrumental in how I think about things. I want to walk you through how what he submits as his model, and then I want to make that relevant to how to use that in Medicare for All discussions, and specifically Medicare for All discussions in the COVID era. So if you've seen this part of my slide before, it's got a twist at the end. It's different than where we were. So Lakoff, in case you're not familiar with his work, he says that his studies, in his words, not mine, his words are that you have one of two models in your head. You've either got a nurturant mother or a strict father model in your head. And that's based largely on how you were brought up. So these are his terms. I wouldn't use quite the sexist language that he's chosen, but nurturant mother or strict father. The nurturant mother tends to favor equality, diversity. They believe in offering a helping hand. In other words, the people he describes as having a nurturant mother model in their head tend to be liberals. Strict fathers believe more in hierarchy, consequences, social Darwinism. In other words, typically more conservatives. So these are the two models that he says, or models that he says people have in their head. But he says some people have actually both of these frames in their head, and they're both active, and it makes them look undecided, but they tend to come in more as independents. So the value of this is two things. First, he says that 20% of Americans only have the nurturant mother model, and 20% of Americans only have the strict father model. But he says actually a strong majority of Americans actually have both. Now, they don't always vote independent, but in terms of their psychology, they actually have both of these frames in their head. And here's how I've just sort of developed a way of using this. When I'm talking to somebody who I can figure out is a liberal, what I try to do with them is talks like we're doing tonight, help them better understand what they're saying that's offending conservative people without realizing that they're doing that. And then, of course, if somebody is already pretty far along a course of thinking in favor of our policies, try to get them to take action and commitments. Conservatives tend to be more invested in values of liberty, as I was alluding to, and consequences and prudence. So with them, the best arguments I found is to talk about not letting anybody, certainly not insurance companies, not employers, take away your choice of physicians. So one thing to really emphasize is you need the freedom to pick your own doctor. And of course, you don't have that under the multi-payer insurance model today, but you do under Medicare, traditional Medicare. It's often good to talk about how much money we're wasting because dialysis gets you into Medicare $85,000 a year or so, whereas insulin or hydrochlorothiazide or blood pressure pills, you can prevent or certainly delay dialysis for years. So if we're going to pony up for dialysis, which we should, of course, wouldn't it make more sense to try to prevent somebody from that kind of an expensive thing? That sometimes gets eyes opened. And then lastly, when I'm talking to somebody conservative today in the year of COVID, with the Lake of the Ozarks story happening, I try to talk about how liberty includes responsibilities, liberty comes with a sense of duty and honor. So trying to hit more of their values. With independence, that's where you want to, when you figure out somebody's an independent, you want to get the nurturing part of their brain working. And that's where a story comes in, try to get them thinking that way. And maybe help them even see that somebody else is using these conservative stories and making you afraid because they're trying to sway you into being more conservative in your point of view. Some folks can really kind of get an aha moment when they realize what Fox News is doing to them because they admit they have both frames in their head. So I think of Jonathan Haidt's work as Lakoff 2.0, which is probably insulting to both Lakoff and Haidt, but it's what I think of them both. And he's collected more data than Lakoff has shared. And at the time that he wrote this book, he had done surveys of 130,000 Americans. Now he's north of 200,000. And he identified what he said are 5 moral pillars or values that people have in their head. And then he related those senses of morality with politics. And I will make this very relevant to how you can talk to conservatives, but I want to walk through what his data showed first. So he said there were 5 moral pillars in this book. He said, first, fairness, and I'm not gonna, I put a few words, his books have literally pages defining each of these 5 values, but they kind of are what they sound like. Fairness, caring, loyalty, authority, and lastly, sanctity. So this is what he says are 5 moral pillars. And more recently, he's added liberty into this too, which is a theme we're going to keep recurring on. So the data gets interesting from him when you look at how he charted it out. He took people on your left, very, very liberal, and on your right, very, very conservative, and correlated their data of their politics with the data of their moral pillars, and found that the most liberals among us score really high endorsement for the value of fairness, and also really high for the value of caring. And I'm willing to bet that that surprises nobody. So fairness and caring are very core values for the very liberal. Liberals don't tend to score as highly on loyalty or authority, or even on his definition of sanctity. So that's the definition of a population that scores as very liberal. Of course, every individual has their own value structure, but in general, that's the population that scores very liberal. Where this gets more interesting is comparing those values to the scores for very conservatives. So it turns out that the very conservatives amongst us don't reject fairness and caring, but they score less intensely on that. And they score more highly on these 3 other values. So it's a different set of moral priorities and values, but it's not an absence of morality. So on the left, when you're looking to the right, you see a significantly lower score on fairness and caring, and you just think you heartless bastards don't even care. But on the right, when you're looking to the left, you see very low scores on some of the things that you cherish, and you see this as a problem that's destructive to society. I've had them actually say that almost in those words to me. So the problem I see from this is that both sides believe that we hold the moral high ground. Both sides act more holy than thou. Both sides inadvertently insult the other side by just implying. Liberals imply a lack of sense of caring amongst conservatives. And I'm here to tell you, I know some very conservative people who donate more of their income and their wealth to charities and to nonprofits than I do, and who volunteer time at things more than I do. So, well, not more time than I do, but you know, to say that they're not concerned about caring or fairness, that's not true. So it's easy to offend somebody. So how do you apply this, especially today? Fairness. Liberals love to say fairness, healthcare is a human right. Love to say that we're here to protect the vulnerable. I'm here to tell you that these arguments are not just ineffective, but actually counterproductive. What the heck is happening here? Now something else is coming up on my screen. Okay, it's actually counterproductive with conservatives. And we love to do things like this, put up signs showing how much income the corporate owners and CEOs have. And liberals love to rail against that as a proof of unfairness. That's not going to get very far with conservatives. On the other hand, loyalty is a core value. The problem with loyalty is that it tends to be local, tends to apply to people with whom you're familiar. And it's very easy to turn people into the other. Not everybody is in my tribe. And so when liberals talk about everybody, like everybody in, that starts to threaten conservatives, because that's beyond my tribe. And we'll talk more about that. But everybody is actually a word. The word everybody is actually charged more than I think many of us realize. So tribalism is what this plays into. And if you haven't seen this book, this is an important piece. And here's an example of how to apply tribalism. So I gave this talk a couple of years ago at a PNHP meeting, and one of the members, Dr. Amy Evans, practiced it when we were speaking. And she had, in 30 seconds, she was going to speak to her Chamber of Commerce. And she practiced what she would say, applying moral principles. And she introduced her talk like this. She said, "Most of you know me as the neighborhood pediatrician, but you may not realize I also run a small business." That's kind of genius, applying these principles. So most of you know me as your neighborhood pediatrician. I'm in your tribe. I run a small business. I'm in your tribe. So she quickly established herself as a tribal member to her Chamber of Commerce. She applied loyalty. I'm in your neighborhood. Authority. I'm a physician and I run a business. She presented herself two more moral pillars, and she tapped into some Lakoff themes, nurturing. Pediatricians have nurturing in a big sign on their forehead, and hierarchy for all the same kind of reasons. So in one sentence, she tapped into all of these moral principles and things that we're using. And if you don't do something like that, you're missing an opportunity to take advantage of Haidt's principles of loyalty. Everybody is not in my tribe. We'll come back to that theme. Authority, the physicians, on the group are you able to use authority and many of us have other ways of using authority, but you don't have any authority until somebody trusts you. So you have to establish a way for them to trust you if you want to be that authority, or find somebody whom they already trust, faith leaders or their physicians, and quote them. Use authority when you're talking about this stuff. And sanctity, it's a core value, but it's only a core value in your tribe. So we need to figure out ways to communicate about this such that the sanctity of lives outside of our own tribes become familiar. And that often means a narrative. So here's a narrative that I submit to you we get wrong more often than we get right when we talk to broader audiences. Healthcare is a human right. So liberals love this. It sucked me right in right at the beginning, and we can defend it. The World Health Organization says healthcare is a human right. It's a great statement to make if you're trying to bring out liberals, if you're trying to speak to liberals. So when Bernie Sanders was campaigning and was trying to get his more inherent audience to come out and vote for him and to work for him, he would repeat this sentence and everybody in his camp would say, yay, yay, yay. And conservatives would get increasingly frightened by this. Healthcare is a human right. I'm not saying never say it. I'm saying be thoughtful about to whom you're saying it. So conservatives, on the other hand, respond not so fast. Where's that in the Constitution? That's my authority that I rely on. Where's that in the Bible? That's my authority that I rely on. So my patients have a human right to wake me up. Doctors actually say that. And American culture values individualism, in case you haven't noticed, and saying that Medicare for all, that means for all, that's sort of corrosive to the idea of my individualism. So with many conservatives for whom liberty is an important value, when we start saying Medicare for all without being more inclusive, and I'll show you how to do it more inclusively, we are threatening this value of individualism. We're hinting at, well, for all, that sounds like the lowest common denominator. We're sort of giving a message that we are giving a message that resonates on the left, not so much at all on the right, and is mixed in the middle. So we tend to want to talk about fairness and caring, and I would say we could talk about loyalty, responsibility, the common good. Is it a human right? I don't know, but it's a part of the common good. And you can unpack that more. The American dream. So I would say healthcare as a human right is a pretty risky phrase to use. The last one of these models I want to walk through is this piece that was published in Psychology Today, actually recently, but it's based on this work from this guy, Drew Harrison, who I think he's at Emory University now. He was on psych faculty at Harvard and a few other, so he's a pretty highbrow psychologist, neuroscientist. And his work includes a lot of functional MRI scanning, brain scanning, looking at how people make decisions. And it's very informative. And he was actually one of the advisors for Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. And one of his lessons is that, I think a thing that we recognize more than we used to, but that the way brains work is we hear an issue, and then we have an emotional response to that activates thunderbolts in our brain. Large anatomic sections of our brain are activated when we hear about an issue. And then that makes an immediate decision. In nanoseconds, the issue comes in, we have an emotional response that we're not even aware of having happened, and the decision-making part of our brain has already reached a decision. And then after that, it comes back to the rest of our brain, the little parts of our brain that do the reasoning. And if you think about it, of course, that's the way brains work. Of course, narratives are what works rather than logic, because for hundreds of thousands of years, that's how we developed. Logic and reasoning are later developments. So this is our process of how we go. And unfortunately, most of our arguments for single payer are based on logic and reasoning rather than and actually are emotionally undermining what we're trying to say. So let's make this a little bit more practical. Let's look at the phrase universal healthcare. And this is what he found when he was studying this for Obama. The phrase universal healthcare resonated as abstract, cold, sterile. Many people thought it was government bureaucracy. It actually activated racism in a lot of folks because it meant, well, you're going to let them folks into my tribe's work. It activated racism amongst people, the phrase universal healthcare. And as a result of those kinds of findings, he discovered that whenever they did polls, the phrase universal healthcare never polled at more than 50% favorable. It was always favorable versus unfavorable as an even match. And yet that's one of our favorite phrases, universal healthcare. He developed a different phrase, which didn't get much adoption by Obama, but he's got evidence that suggests maybe not these words, but this concept, the phrase a doctor for every family. Really the same thing, right? Really the same statement, a doctor for every family. This phrase, he says, establishes a warmer personal connection to families, to your doctor, your personal doctor, puts you in control of the decision. A doctor for every family sounds profoundly different than universal healthcare. A doctor for every family, that doesn't hint at a lowest common denominator, that hints more at high quality care. It still says nobody left out. A doctor for every family still implies nobody left out without being, that's a warmer way to say it, just like no child left behind. It's a warmer way to say it. And as a result of those kinds of characteristics of this kind of phrase, he found that polled at 70% favorable and was much more resistant to attacks of socialized medicine and such that universal healthcare. Universal healthcare was very vulnerable to being attacked and still is, as socialized medicine. A doctor for every family, that doesn't sound like socialism at all. And as a result, it scored much higher. And I'm not saying that's the phrase we have to use. I'm saying be thoughtful about to whom you're speaking and whether you're inadvertently tripping the wrong parts of their brain. Words like the uninsured resonate with many liberals because we realize that this is a huge problem and we're concerned about it. But that's a way of describing things that's nameless and faceless. He recommends a phrase like people who have lost their insurance through no fault of their own. It's more words and it's a little harder to say, but the phrase the uninsured, that's cold, it's nameless, it's faceless. People who have lost their insurance through no fault of their own, those are real people. On the left, for the nameless, faceless, you see masses of people that you're kind of frightened by. On the right, you see real people that are suffering. So whether that's a good thing to raise or not, but it's a very different way to think about it. People who have lost their insurance through no fault of their own. The uninsured sounds like them. It's easily categorized as the other, outside of my tribe. Whereas people who've lost their insurance, that probably includes somebody that you already know and care about. So it's a more engaging way. You lost your uninsured. Well, why? Were they lazy? Didn't they plan for this contingency? Why are they uninsured? Maybe they deserve it. Lakoff would say that they deserve it. That people would think that, well, you deserve it. People who have lost their insurance through no fault of their own, well, that could be me. I could tomorrow be that person. So you're talking about a solution for a problem that I might wind up having tomorrow if my employer goes belly up, in the circumstance we're in. And then lastly, if the phrase "the uninsured" can activate racism, one thing that Western suggests is before you even say it, try immunizing against racism to a certain degree by saying, white, black, or brown, anybody who needs healthcare needs to have a way to solve this. So immunizing up front with a phrase like white, black, or brown, any person who needs this. So different ways of framing this. And last thing I want to say is we know this guy, and let me just say he was not famous for this. He did not say, I have a plan. I'm stealing this from Western's article. So think about that. I keep on coming back to when did Warren plummet in the polls, and my observation was that she plummeted in the polls when she took the bait and wrote out a 200-page plan, a 100-page operational plan and a 100-page economic plan for Medicare for All. Almost immediately after she did that, her popularity plummeted. And the phrase, I have a plan, resonates with me because I really want somebody who has a plan. I see a plan as a good thing, but a plan is not a dream, you know, a plan is not a dream, it's not a motivation. So, you know, when we're giving our talks, we, you know, need to set up the problem and talk a bit about the solution, but our discussion about the solutions needs to be brief, and our discussion about hope, you know, hope and change, to go to that phrase, it has to be more robust. I have a plan isn't going to get very many people to come vote for you, I don't think. So there's a lot more resources, of course, at PNHP if you're not familiar with it, but there we go. Let me figure out how to stop sharing that and go back into this. And I hit your time bogey. Good.
Ed,
Stuff
thank
is so
you
beautiful.
so
Ed.
much. That was great. I'm sorry, I have been having some internet issues here, so I'm not going to do my video. You're just looking at my photo instead of my my face and smile. But what I'd like to know now is if people have questions, if they could raise their hand on the bar. You know, we've talked earlier about how you raise your hands under the part. If you click on the participants, you can see an option to raise your hand. Then we can call on folks, and Ed can answer some of your questions here.
That'd be great if we do it that way, because if I have to try to read all the questions, it gets really distracting. So
yeah, so Barb Ryan has a question. Barb, can you unmute yourself and tell us your question?
Sure. I just forgot one of them. But one of the things that I struggle with personally is, you know, when you showed the slide of the liberal and the conservative and the independents in the middle. And even when I'm dealing with family members, I want to say to my 3 older brothers who voted for Trump, we were raised by the same parents. How in God's name, is it because of nurture versus nature that I am different from you, you know? So do you get what I'm getting at?
yeah, how can people raised in very similar environments wind up with very different philosophical points of view, is what you're asking, correct? Oh, now my screen just got screwed up again. Let me try to fix this. Okay, so that's kind of what you're asking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I ponder this too. I don't know that I have a definitive answer, and Lakoff doesn't give a definitive answer to it, but I think part of the answer, of course, is that we're not all raised the same. You know, my brother was raised by the same parents within 3.5 years of me. He was the firstborn. It was a very different environment than I was brought up in. I don't think, you know, there's so many things that go into forming who we are that I don't think that's very surprising that some of our models are different about that. I don't think anybody understands really well how those get established.
I've tried to use that argument to shame them. And that isn't working either.
It didn't work, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the answer is to look for the common ground rather than to, you know, shame.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think that Ed had some good ideas of some different tactics to look at, some of the loyalty issues and things like that. Linda, can you share what your question was?
Yes, I have been giving healthcare presentations all over the valley for single payer in Phoenix here, and I just did every one of the wrong things that you mentioned. Yeah, and I'm wondering if it's possible to have your presentation, because I was taking notes furiously, but I couldn't get it all, and I want to go over it and change my slides. And
what
you've said.
Let me say 2 things. Well, 3 things. First, thank you. Second, this is an aspirational talk. I have not mastered doing all of these things all the time. I do really stupid things all the time. But thirdly, you know, I've now given like 576 talks, I think it is. And the first several of them, I made all of these mistakes. I used to open my talk with well, we all believe healthcare is a human right, correct? So let's go on from there. And
yes, I do that. And I
so be of good cheer. You know, we always try to improve.
Oh, goodness. So is it possible by any chance to be able to see your presentation so I can really study it and take notes? And
Well, I think they're recording it,
Okay.
and there's a earlier version of this up on the PNHP website, I really kind of enjoyed thinking it through in this way. So I'm probably going to
Great, thank
make a
you.
different freestanding video of it. And Patty Harvey has a version of it posted someplace, right? I don't know if you're able to say that.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. And we are recording this also, if that's okay, Ed.
Oh, yeah, please. Wait a minute, stop the camera.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to share that I lost my internet again. So Barbara, if you might be able to help Mike with moderating and taking the questions after this, if I'm not jumping in. So also when I lost my internet, I lost the chat questions. So I don't know if there were people who asked any questions in the chat bar. So Barbara Pearson, can you take a peek for that and see if you see some questions in the chat bar? And
Okay, except Ed also asked people to just sort of wave their hand, and so that we weren't multitasking so much.
okay,
So
yeah.
I'll do what you say. I'm obedient, but and loyal. But I also think that it'll possibly take some of his own questions while he's waiting for me.
Right, so I see that William Bronston and Maureen Cruz and Chuck Pinocchio have their hands up. So if you can each be ready to unmute yourselves. And so William Bronston?
Ed, is there a difference in talking to different age people? Like, do you talk with students? Does any of this vary when you're talking to kids that are just coming into medicine with their aspirations? You think they're locked in as tight as grown-ups on this stuff?
That's a really good question. I think by the fact that you're answering it, you're asking it, you probably have had the same experience I have, which is that it's a little bit easier to open minds of folks who haven't spent 70 years hating what we're talking about. And I think our opportunity, I think that you're right. I think the messages need to be a little bit different. The general structure is the same. I think there are still, very liberal and very conservative amongst all age groups. And I think the general structure of the answer has to match that. But you're right, the way you speak about it. Do you have a specific, it sounds like you probably have a real specific thought you're thinking about with this.
Well, a couple things. I was a student organizer the whole time I was in medical school and afterwards. And we just had this gigantic avalanche of activism that happened in those days because of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And today, the students are very, very co-opted in liberal school systems where they're involved in a variety of different project groupings that break them up and that don't give them a sense of the centrality of what single payer is all about, universal health, well, rightful healthcare is all about. It just seems to me a whole different thing. And unless the students lead, we're in real trouble, because I don't think that those of us that are seniors are going to move the country and move the profession the way the student community will. The other question I have is how you build in stories when PNHP, for example, none of us have been organizing around special interests like obstetrics or pediatrics or public health or family medicine or nephrology. I mean, there are no coordinates inside our movement where physicians that are in the same area that are oppressed by the way in which the practice is imposed because of the money-driven system have created a selling vision of what a progressive universal healthcare system would look and feel like in practice.
Yeah, to go back to the first thing you raised, I would say sort of a fear and a hope amongst the younger folks is the fear I have is that so many of them don't believe that Medicare will be there in existence for them when they become of Medicare age. And so when we talk about protecting, Medicare, there's a disconnect for many of them. It's like, that's for you guys. On the other hand, the cause for hope is that that's an age group, an age cohort that is way more passionate about Medicare for all. So it's sort of both sides. And I think the reason that they're so passionate about it is because they know how important it is. and they see it as really in jeopardy, and they want it. So I think there's a real cause for optimism. You know, younger folks are frankly are starting to step up and drive it. And the most exciting stuff going on in P&HP, for example, I think is the student work. There is a growing commitment within P&HP to branch out into other specialties. That's a heavier lift, as you know. But I think you're spot on that there's recognition that we need to be more effective at that. That is harder to do, but we have more and more representation amongst subspecialists. So it's cause for hope again.
Thank
So
you,
I
Ed.
see a couple of questions. This is Barbara. I see a couple of questions about, so if it's not Medicare for all, is it Medicare for you and your tribe? I know you put, I just remember you said a doctor for every family, but sometimes doctor is also a little elitist too. So you have some more to elaborate on that for a couple of people on the call.
Yeah, I don't know the right answer for that. This is, just sort of an evolving thought in my head, but I don't think we should shun or skirt or not use the phrase Medicare for all. I just think we need to be cognizant of the fact that that's tripping some radioactive buttons that I hadn't really realized we were tripping. And rather than make the whole thing Medicare for all, Medicare for all, Medicare for all, single payer, rather than do that, I think phrases like a doctor for every family, we just need to use that more, and sort of change the spotlight over into that direction. And then, once you've gotten to that point, then say, but the way we accomplish that is through this legislation that's called, it's called Medicare for all. So you're right. It's a balancing act, but I think up until now, we've not tried to balance that at all. We've just ignored this, I think, really important data point that I was unaware of.
Right. Erica Ferenstein, do you still have a question? Are you here, Erica?
Actually, Barbara, Maureen and Chuck had their hands up earlier.
Oh,
So
okay.
Maureen's next on the deck, then Chuck, and then Erica. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Maureen,
Names, but actually Erica was first. She just had it written in the chat instead of her hand up. So I don't know if you want to let her go first, but she was ahead of all of us, I think.
So this is not how a group discussion would go with a Republican crowd.
I know.
Hey, Maureen, you go, girl. You
I'm a
go.
nurse, okay? And she's my friend.
okay, we'll get to you all. So Maureen, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for all the work that you've done, Dr. Weisbart. I really appreciate it. My question is, there are two narrators. I'm wondering what you think about using these, because I do, but I don't know if they're effective. And one is the economic argument. I say to people, look, this is you are already paying, we are already all paying for healthcare that we're not getting. That this is a system of extraction, that through our taxes, we're already paying for 70% of the care, but we're just not getting it. And we deserve to get it because that's our money. And the other argument I'm wondering about is that, healthcare is about us and our doctors. It's not right now. The person in control is someone sitting in an office, maybe with a degree in business, and they're deciding what our doctors can and cannot give us. And, that really interferes with good medicine, and we all want good health care. I mean, those are two arguments I use, but I don't know if those would resonate. If you think, given all that you've read, I haven't read those books, if you think those would resonate.
Yeah, no, I think those are great arguments. I use them both too, and you of course, as I'm sure you were doing, you have to use them selectively in the right audience. So business groups are already aware that their healthcare expense is the least manageable, most rapidly rising line on their overhead, and they don't, and that's changing, right? When you had this conversation about the expense of healthcare that you're paying for already, if you had that conversation with them 10 years ago, it was, yeah, it's a big part of my expense. it's item number 12 on my priority list of expenses. And that issue that it was item number 12 was up against the problem of, I don't want government taking over my widget factory. If I let government take over healthcare, then I'm going to have government taking over my widgets, and we don't want my widgets or my widgets. Stay out of that. This is so, but that's changed.
I wasn't meaning about businesses. I mean,
Okay.
individuals through taxes, through our taxes, we are already paying for healthcare that we're being denied. Whether we actually get it or not, we are paying taxes for other people's healthcare. So it really wasn't about the business. Sorry for interrupting you, but it wasn't about the business end. It was about as individuals that we're already paying for this and we're being denied. And to me, that's being scammed. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that's an argument you think would work with more conservative people or not.
Yes, I do. Because, if there's one value that they have, it's prudence. It's don't take my money. Was it Thomas Jefferson that said, don't reach in, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't break my arm or reach into my pocket. So, you're reaching into my pocket when when you're doing this, you're wasting it, and that's the phrase, the phrase, you can save money through Medicare for all is nowhere near as motivating as the phrase, you're wasting money under today's model. So the behavioral economists talk to us about loss aversion, that losing something that you have is twice as motivating as the possibility of gaining that bird in the bush. So yeah, saying that I would actually use words like you're wasting your money, today.
I say you're being ripped off.
Yeah,
that's the same I say we are being ripped off. We're paying for something that we're not getting because our dollars are being extracted away from our care.
Yes.
For profit. And we're being denied and we're paying for it. So.
And the other argument you raised too about, healthcare should be between you and your doctor is a compelling one. But then they'll say, well, I don't want government getting between me and my doctor. And that's where you can maybe talk about how non-intrusive traditional Medicare is. There's probably every doctor will tell you that if a patient has traditional Medicare, not Medicare Advantage, but traditional Medicare, it's way easier for them to just do what they need to do. It's Medicare Advantage that gets in between patients and doctors. It's insurance companies that get in between patients and doctors. So they don't have to do that, and that's happening today. Medicare for all means you have a much more sacrosanct relationship with your doctor.
Thank you so much, Ed. Can we move on to Chuck Pinocchio? He's had his hand up. And then Erica is on the deck, and after that, Joanne.
All right, Ed, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. I think we're very much on the same page here. At One Pair States, we've been working at this for about 2.5 years, developing new communication strategies, understanding better vision, values, framing, inoculation, and narrative. So very much appreciate your work. I'd love to catch up to you on email. But what I was going to ask you is the title of your presentation has wrapped around it the coronavirus moment where we are right now. But I'd love to, I don't know that I heard much discussion about what this moment offers us as an opportunity. And just so you know, we had a brief discussion, about 6 of us prior to your coming on, to discuss how do we get after the 43 million newly unemployed Americans. Their calculations have changed radically overnight. Many of them, of course, are uninsured now and their dependents. How can we reframe that? And also, there is actually a spike in favorability toward the government, especially state governments. You're probably seeing those statistics as well. So the terrain, the environment, the context, I think has changed a little bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what we're facing right now and how that may alter your research and your findings prior to the pandemic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a definitive answer for you. It's the question that I've been wrestling with the last few days primarily.
Yeah.
And to me, the stuff that went on at the Lake of the Ozarks really sort of illuminated things that I hadn't quite realized about that. But what to do with it, I think what to do with it is to recognize the importance of personal liberty and how that sense of personal liberty is easily threatened, and how we have to kind of work within the importance of that value. But I agree. I don't know what to tell you other than I really agree with you that this seems like an incredibly ripe moment for us to make our pitch and to make it more strongly.
Can I add something to that, Ed? This is Carol.
Yes.
I think this is a great opportunity to talk about what a bad idea it ever was to link employment to healthcare, health insurance. And this pandemic is just bringing that home in so many ways. I think that's a message we should be putting out there over and over and over. And who doesn't have a family member or a friend who has not lost their job through no fault of their own, and now has also either lost their health insurance or never had health insurance, and this pandemic is decimating them.
Thank you, Carol. I'm wondering whether either Carol or Ed could share a brief capsulation of how you would note how it came to be that employment was tied to healthcare, because the whole push after during World War II to have insurance be a way to attract people into the workforce when all the men went overseas. Can somebody say that in a more eloquent and a better way than how I just described it? Just so that we can all kind of know that we're saying something factual when we present this.
You mean you want to hear what the facts are, or you want to hear how we would message it?
I would like to hear how you would say it compactly to a conservative person. Like, because you don't want to spend too long belaboring that when you really want to be talking about why, what we want to do now instead of talking about, oh, it was never should have been, the two should have never been tied together. Well, briefly explain why they were, and then talk about how we can, move on to whatever else you would want to say in the conversation, depending on the context.
So I think when you're talking to conservatives, it's important to not imply that the country is as stupid as we know the country is.
Right.
They don't like to hear that. So instead, I think it's important to frame it of, we were in World War II. We needed to make sure that we had production capabilities. We lost, a lot of our citizenry went into the military, and we saw this problem with wages and stuff, and we put in a program that would freeze wages, and to manage that, we let employers have access to, I don't know if that's actually exactly right the way I just said that, but we let employers attract employees through this health insurance, through benefits, including health insurance. And that was not a crazy idea in World War II, but unfortunately we've tried that now for 70 years or whatever that is. And we've discovered that it's time to stop this little experiment. Other countries didn't try it that way. Other countries went with other solutions. We need to figure out that it's time to stop this silly experiment that we did because of all the obvious reasons. That wasn't very succinct or pointed either.
Well, one thing I mention when this comes up is I say that this worked really well for decades, because at that time, most people were in the same job for their entire careers. But great. Now society has changed, and on average, people change jobs 12 times during their working life. So now that system no longer fits our current social model. So that's how I explain it.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was great. Thank you. Okay, so we had Erica still on hold here.
Hi, Dr. Weisbart. Thank you so much. Just one thing, I'm not sure if you thought of this or realized this, but I've been doing a lot of ally work with Black Lives Matter here in Los Angeles. And one of the things that I learned, surprisingly, was the all word is also triggering for our brothers and sisters in the Black community, because historically they feel that when everything is for all, it doesn't include them.
Oh.
So I just thought I would share that with you. The other thing that I want to ask, and maybe it's not quite on topic, so maybe it's your next speech, but here in California, we have not just a Democratic governor and a Democratic majority, but we have a Democratic supermajority. And 80% of Democrats in California, and I think Maureen can correct me, about 70% of Republicans all want, we'll just call it single payer health care. And yet I see the Republicans as my second opponent where I'm coming from. So, and I know that the reason is because of the money. They're getting, you know, it was just in the papers, Blue Shield contributed $1 million to Governor Newsom's campaign, and they're very good. They say they want it, but then they say this but and lead us to public option. So just wondering, you know, do these same principles you're applying here of the way to talk to conservatives, I mean, does it apply to our Democrat supermajority, or is that part two when you come back?
Well, frankly, I think one of the things I like about Medicare for All as a topic is the question that usually comes up, well, why don't we already have it? You know, smart guy, why don't we already have it? And the obvious answer is campaign finance, because I think, you know, I think you're spot on. Policies don't happen, or laws don't get passed because we reach a certain threshold of popular support on polls. They pass, you know, they pass when they pass based on votes, you know, who comes out to vote. That's why this topic to me must lead us to get out the vote movements and to campaign finance reform movements. We have expertise on the healthcare piece of it, but we need to form much stronger relationships with those other groups. Use our voice to motivate. If you're wondering why we don't have healthcare yet, when 80% of us think we should, join the movement to get out the vote. Vote these people out.
Carol?
Can I add to that also?
Please
that
do.
I don't think we call out enough the degree of media capture that exists in this country. When at the Democratic debates, they can refer to private health insurance versus a government takeover of healthcare. The opposite of private insurance is public insurance. The opposite of government-run healthcare is corporate-run healthcare. And when you do a Google search of government-run healthcare, in the literature, it pops up now hundreds of thousands of times in the media. When you do this Google, there's a Google search thing. If you look up corporate-run healthcare, it showed up 3 times.
And you were 2 of those 3.
Right.
Right. So I think we have to do our job calling out the false, what's that called? A false,
Flag?
when you compare, not,
Dichotomy.
False equivalence.
Dichotomy.
Yeah.
False equivalence.
False
No?
equivalence.
yeah, false equivalence, thank you. And you can, I did that in a talk at UPenn, and I really got a lot of laughs because the numbers were so outrageous and people could wrap their heads around, oh my God, I really did hear that. And it went right past me. I let them get away with a false equivalence of private health insurance and government-run healthcare. And I just think we can keep calling people out when they do that, and then be careful ourselves when we're writing and not accidentally do that, which I think has happened for me anyway.
I have a question for the two of you. So Carol, feel free to answer this since it's in direct response to what you just said. When you say we need to call the media out, are you saying writing letters to the editors of papers that have done that, or when it's happened on TV, like after that, after the debate, you know, where do you call them out publicly enough to have it actually have any impact?
Oh, on Twitter.
Oh, okay.
Instant Twitter. Call them out. That's where, in my opinion, we need to be using social media to call people out for stuff like that. One guy who I think is great at it is Anand Giridharadas, who wrote Winners Take All, which is a book that I highly recommend. And he's on Twitter all the time calling out philanthropists for the baloney that we've essentially said, you know, philanthropists are the solution to all of our social problems because after all, they've been so good at business. Of course, they can fix our social problems too. When in fact, his whole book is about how, yeah, they'll fix our problems in a way that makes sure that nothing that we do impacts their ability to continue to make a shit ton of money and throw chump change philanthropically and then get, you know, nominated to be a Nobel Peace Prize winner because they threw some money at it. So I think we need to use social media to call them out immediately when we hear it, and then hope we get retweeted and retweeted and retweeted.